This is the SONCOZ SGD1 DAC, and on top of it is the SONCOZ QXD1 DAC. Both of these DACs measure very well, but how good do they sound? So HiFiGo sent me both to try out. Today we're going to look at the SGD1, the bigger brother of the two DACs, and well, initially you can't fault the minimalist look of the front panel, which lights up as appropriate when certain inputs are selected or certain options are selected. But as always, I like to start with the back. As far as DACs go, it's fairly conventional. You have, well, a bunch of digital inputs and a couple of analog outputs. Now, you'll probably notice that it is a DAC with a balanced output. That is, it has two XLR sockets, one for left and one for right, and also has single-ended outputs, just these two RCA sockets, which are, as usual, white for left and red for right. Now, whether it's balanced or single-ended probably won't affect much, but maybe it's kind of useful if you're using it, say, with active speakers or certain power amps where you do want balanced output, or certain headphone amps which are balanced all the way through. But on the digital inputs, maybe the confusing thing some people have noted is that the digital inputs look much like the analog outputs, and they use the same kinds of connectors, yet these are digital and these are analog. Now, for the digital inputs, probably most people will be using the USB, and uniquely for the SGD1, it has both a USB-C input here and a regular USB-B input. So if you have a regular A to B cable maybe from your computer, you'll probably use the B input, and maybe if you have some device that you want to use the USB-C input, you might use this one instead, but it should be either or, and you can select them using the remote control. Now you also have your usual TOS-Link input, which is an optical version of the SPDIF input, which is here. Now SPDIF stands for Sony Philips Digital Interface. So that's the kind of basic input you have there, and also has a pass-through output, which is very handy if you want to connect up multiple digital components. Now, if you're wondering why there's an XLR input here, that's kind of, to oversimplify things, that's the kind of balanced version of this input. And maybe if you have some device which you want to use, which is maybe has a higher quality digital output than maybe your computer's motherboard, which you might use with USB, then some people like to use various, say, USB or network converters or streamers from which you can get an AES output, and it has much the same benefits as kind of the balanced outputs of the DAC itself, in that you can use a longer cable and reduce the amount of interference it will receive, and maybe especially if you're like me and you have a lot of gear around here, and reducing interference is often very helpful. Other than that, the only thing it may be missing is some DACs these days have an I2S input, and that's a special kind of input used for connecting high quality, usually streamers or USB to SPDIF converters for a higher quality digital input. And that's something that you may be getting into a little bit of the more difficult issues that you get with digital, but all the same, it has a fairly conventional setup. And you can also set it either for 110 volts or 240 volts on the back. You don't have to buy a special version. Other than that, the power switch is on the back. Now, on the front, well, you have a single knob, and the single knob presses and it turns. Otherwise, everything else is managed via, well, a remote control. And if you've seen this remote control, and it looks very familiar to remote controls you've seen from other DACs, and even things like Google components, you're probably not wrong. They probably all come from the same factory and the same manufacturer. It allows you to select the inputs, USB, B, C, Bluetooth as well, which is included, optical, RCA and AES, and control some of the other features which we're going to look at now. Okay, so I thought we'd have a look inside the SGD1. It's quite interesting, in fact. So on the left-hand side here, much like other DACs, we have a big power supply. Well, the more separate you have the power supply, in other words, the different sections, if they have their own separate power supplies, the better the performance overall, as they require different voltages, and then the power supplies don't interfere with each other through, say, noise and other issues. This is good that we have two transformers here, and we have the conversion from AC to DC through here, and then different power supply groups. And if we actually take a peek underneath the this power supply connector going from the power supply to the main board, we actually can see some voltage numbers poking out there. Don't know how well you can see in there, but it actually says on the left, says D7 volts, which I presume is the digital section, 7 volts. Then a ground, and then A 7 volts, which I presume is for the analog section, 7 volts, and then a ground, and then 12 volts plus 12 volts and ground. So there's a balanced 12 volt input there, and bipolar, I should say. And I'm not sure quite what that's for, maybe part of the analog section as well, we don't know. But it's good to see that we've got 3 separate power supplies coming off here with 2 transformers, and that's generally a good sign. Now we also, here next we have the digital input section. So you can see here we have over here, this is above the TOSLink, the USB, the SPDIF in and out, and AES input. Now, other than the USB, they go into this AKM chip here. So that's the SPDIF management thing there. And the USB, of course, goes into this XMOS chip, and they've become quite good lately. And that's, I presume, all the electronics for handling that. Now, we also have, of course, a USB-C input, so I suppose there is this kind of switching there for the multiple inputs, I guess. Now, the interesting thing is we have this blue thing here, which is a Bluetooth chip. So you can see the CSR logo on it, just maybe it's very tiny in this video. And it says aptX HD, so there's your USB, your Bluetooth aerial coming down here along with another one. The other one is OTA, and that's for the over-the-air firmware update. Now, the only thing this thing does wirelessly, in case you're wondering, is it will update its own firmware. It can't do anything else using the wireless, but it's very handy that if there is a firmware update, the manufacturer can push it out, and this will automatically update once you've programmed it through the Android app. Now, this is all managed, I guess, by this little chip here, which I guess has all the programming logic in here. And we can also see another 3 volt testing area here. So I guess one of these power supplies in here for the digital is split through this little power supply here into 3 volts and maybe other voltages as necessary. And we probably have a programming interface here, which they'll plug in and do the programming probably for this chip as required. Now, so as next on, we have the analog stage, and this is where things get interesting. You may notice that there's a volume control, and that's on its own little board here. Now, you'll see it's not connected to the analog stage at all. It's actually connected to the digital stage through the front panel here. And I'm going to talk about that in just a sec. But here we have a little bit of a power supply, I guess, probably maybe for the chips, the ES9038Q2M chips here. And that you can just see the traces on the board come around from the digital section into the analog section. And this converts the digital, of course, into the analog signal, and then it passes through an amplification stage, which consists of op amps and buffers, I guess, and maybe is necessary single-ended or balanced conversion. They also have the effect of filtering out very high-frequency noise that comes off standard off-the-shelf chips, and so they do actually have a dual function there. You can't just have output straight from the chips into kind of the output. First of all, it's not strong enough, and second of all, you just have a lot of high-frequency noise dumped in there as well. Now, interesting thing about the volume, as I said, is now how do you control the volume? Well, there are a number of different options. You could have it like a physical volume control, which actually controlled the output level, or you could have some chips, so I think even some of the Sabre, they all combined all in one Sabre chips, and some of the others have a volume control built into the chip themselves. A third way is to use your own kind of logic system for programming the output, and that's presumably what happens here. The interesting thing is if I turn this up, you can actually see if you look at the bottom of the volume control, I don't know how well this is going to work, there is a chip on here, and maybe that is connected with this, because this is actually a rotary encoder. It just turns endlessly, and of course it's got this terribly wobbly knob, which is not so good. And all the rotary encoder does is it tells the logic, which is probably programmed through here, to adjust one way or the other. And this has also got a little light that shines on the back here, so it's a specific rotary encoder which we saw. And it it changes a set of LEDs, and it has a set of LEDs in here which you can probably just see. You can just see the little bumps behind on the other side of the board for the LEDs that light up behind the front panel. So it's quite interesting as things go, the setup. And I presume there's some kind of digital volume control, maybe either through this logic or through the Sabre logic if it's built into the 9038 chips, which I don't recall if it is or it isn't. Anyway, let's get on to looking at the actual performance aspects of the DAC itself. Before we get into the sound details, it's worth quickly talking about the volume control, because there's one critical feature that is here. Now, you can control the volume, of course, using this knob, or using the remote control here, using the volume buttons. And when I first plugged the SGD1 in, I wasn't getting any sound. And of course, it's indicating that the volume is at 0, and all the inputs default to a volume that's at 0, but I didn't realize this, and I was wondering why nothing was working. And considering how complex my setup is, it took me a bit of troubleshooting to realize it. Now, the volume control, as we saw, it has rotary encoder here with little LED lights, and I'll just run up the volume using the remote control. Look at the volume knob. It lights up in bursts, as you can see. And that's a kind of pretty cool thing, although, of course, indicating specifically 0 volume not being indicated was, well, indicated but not indicated was a a little bit irritating. The other thing is of course that each input is set separately. So now if I switch to the USB-C input, oh, the volume's gone back to 0 because the volume is for each input is separately managed. So if I turn that up now, say to turn the volume up by say half here and go back to USB-B, well, USB-B was already at full and then USB-C was at half. And so again, it keeps the preset for each input. And you also see that the lights along the bottom, which I'll just change, are for the digital filter, and they are set per input as well. So the default is apodizing there, which I've set. Now if I go back to USB-B, that had the hybrid filter, was the last filter I used on that. And so of course as I switch between inputs, the filter changes and the volume setting changes as required. And that's something to note. It's something I sometimes wished was defeatable, like having one volume control and one filter for all. So that'd be maybe a nice firmware update option to have if it's possible from the manufacturer, but something to note all the same. As far as listening with the SGD1 went, well, it's a little bit tricky talking about DACs and sound quality because the differences can be very subtle between them, and it very much depends on the kind of music you listen to. So if you listen to, say, Spotify MP3, and maybe you're not going to notice so much of a difference between a cheap DAC and a more expensive one, especially if the recording quality of the music you like is kind of average, or it's very compressed, or the singer's been using auto-tune and that kind of thing. Whereas, like me, I listen to a lot of high-quality music, say like David Chesky music, some of their binaural recordings, which are fantastic quality. And I will really notice the difference between, say, less expensive components and more expensive ones, especially as I do have very expensive headphones here, Foco Utopias, Final D8000 Pros, Meze Empyreans, and that kind of thing. It's going to be more noticeable to me, and especially with more expensive headphone amps to use them with as well. So in that, there are two kind of aspects to it. Let's say you're someone, maybe you're watching this video because you're interested. Is the SGD1 going to be a good upgrade from my cheap DAC? Maybe you have something like an O2 DAC or a shit Magni or something like that. Or maybe you've just been listening from the sound card straight out of your computer. And in that, very likely something around this kind of price range is going to be an improvement over one of those cheaper DACs. And in my experience playing around with DACs recently, that is definitely the case there. Generally, especially up to the $500 mark, and maybe a little bit less up to the $1,000 mark, there is generally an improvement as you spend more money. What you're getting is a better power supply for the DAC, and better power supplies might separate out the power supplies for the individual sections inside the DAC, meaning they don't interfere with each other, and the output has better quality sound. Maybe you're getting better components in there, or a more complex design in there, and that again will produce better quality output. So you are definitely paying for something there. It can be a little bit of a challenge when you're going up to something like a $2,500 DAC, like this shit Yggdrasil that I have here, or something like the HiFiGo 2, which I have on my desk. That's where things get a little bit more tricky, and that's where it's very dependent, again, on the rest of the equipment and the music you listen to, whether you'll notice a difference. So from that aspect, I always try and find the absolute performance, and so I listen with very high quality music, and I plug the SGD1 and the other DACs into Audio GD's Master 9, which is my main headphone amp, alongside ALO Audio Studio 6. Now the Master 9 is a very kind of clean, clear, it's designed to be absolutely get out of the way of the music and just let the music through as it is kind of design. So in that I could get a good handle on the kind of performance of the SGD1. So as far as that goes, well, it was designed to be very kind of uncolored and measure very well. And that means that the designer will not have kind of tweaked the circuit to sound a little bit euphonic, which you sometimes get in designs, or he may not have gone out and selected components just on how they sound. He may not have, but generally the aim is to be kind of absolutely uncolored. And that was very apparent in the design from the SGD1. It was very uncolored, very clean, very clear. One of my early listening experiments was through the THX AAA 789 because the weather was hot, too hot to run this thing, and it was kind of very clean, clear sound out of it. Now the interesting thing is it also allows you to switch the digital filters in there. Now digital filters is how the music is processed through the digital to analog chip, and in this case they're built into the ESS Sabre 9038 that are in there. Now in some DACs such as the Topping D90, maybe I couldn't notice so much difference between the filters. I actually did notice them a fair bit in the SGD1. Now, one of the experiments I did was I hooked up the SGD1 and Shit Audio's Yggdrasil into the Master 9, level matched, and had a listen to both. And I found that the Shit Audio's Yggdrasil definitely was improved on the output of the music. with the high quality David Chesky and other recordings that I have, the center image was more clear. There was more of a sense of depth to the music. It was, you could hear more of the nuances and like the instruments, like how, or maybe how the sound echoes off the walls of the studio or the venue. The note decay. Definitely more clear out of the Yggdrasil. Likewise, a little bit clearer out of Topping's D90, which is not that a great deal more expensive than the SGD1. Even with the USB input going to both of them, and I thought that the Topping, if you've seen my review of it, I thought that the performance was better using something like this Kitsune Tuned Edition SU1 here to provide the digital input, or the SoundAware D300 reference streamer. Even just using the probably the least ideal USB input of this versus USB input of the SGD1, the Topping was still a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more detailed, and a little bit smoother sounding. But it's interesting, when I was comparing it with the Yggdrasil, I felt the SGD1 was a little bit kind of maybe kind of flat sounding, something I've noticed in ESS Sabre based designs, which are kind of less expensive. A little bit more kind of grey in the sound, a little bit touch unnatural. So I played around with the digital filters, as I was primarily using the default apodizing filter and the brick wall filter, which are technically the best ones there. Now switching to this interesting hybrid filter, which I don't know a lot about, the sound softened just a touch, and that allowed it to sound a little bit kind of more musical. However, when I was listening with that, I was listening to some music with very clear cymbals on there, and the cymbals sounded a little bit muted. So I switched back to the brick wall filter for that, and that sounded a little bit more clear. So it seemed to be a little bit of a compromise between a little bit kind of maybe a little bit kind of flattish, kind of but sharp but clear sound, versus a little bit more kind of slightly softer but still not greatly clear, even slightly less clear sound with the SGD1. So I noticed that it was a step behind kind of much more expensive DACs, definitively, even if it was a step up from less expensive ones in general. Now, just as an experiment, like I did with the Topping, I plugged it into my SoundAware D300 reference to see if I could improve over the input using a high quality digital converter, just out of interest to see how the USB input fared. And I didn't really notice any kind of improvement like I had with the Topping. It still sounded much the same. So overall, that gave me the thought that, well, the SGD1, it's not a super high-end DAC. I mean, I know that a lot of manufacturers like to tout how amazing their measurements are. I mean, it measures very well, and it sounds pretty okay plugged into the gear I have. And as I said earlier on, if you're someone who's moving up to this kind of level of DAC, it's going to definitely be an improvement. But it's not going to knock down any super, high-end components off their perch as sounding better. It's something that actually I would probably say you should compromise things a little bit and use something which is kind of clean and clear sounding like this with something a little bit euphonic, like maybe even a tube amp. And this is what I do with the Shit Audio's Yggdrasil and the Studio 6. I've got some tubes in there that have a little bit of a maybe less than accurate and a little bit more euphonic kind of signature in there. And I find that kind of the drier sound of the Yggdrasil with the Studio 6 makes for a really enjoyable listen, especially with some of these very precise sounding headphones, which, if you play them, say, straight out of something like Chords Hugo 2, can sound a little bit kind of too perfect. Sometimes you do want a little bit of compromise in there, even if it does mean using something like the single-ended output of a DAC, which was designed to be balanced. So overall, SGD1, yes, I'd say it's good on, and it's about spot on in value at, under $500 mark, and especially with features such as being able to the firmware self-upgrading, and it has the usual slew of features such as Bluetooth and the like. If it weren't for this kind of little wobbly knob that was here, which kind of detracts slightly from the design, and the fact that when I first turned it down, the volume was always down to 0 on all the inputs, making me think I'd done something wrong. Apart from those little niggles, actually I thought that the overall DAC is pretty decent, and I'd say it's a pretty good buy. So I hope this review of SONCOZ's SGD1 was helpful, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when I have more reviews out. Also, these reviews are possible due to the names of the people you see on screen, as well as many other people who you don't see. And it's because of them I can make these videos. Now, if you'd like my buying advice, if you'd like this kind of information about what's best to get, setting things up, do consider becoming a supporter, and I will happily help you out. I had a lot of people sign up and immediately ask me questions, and by helping me, I like to help them, and everyone wins in this. So if you'd like to become a supporter, check out the links on screen or in the description, and join up, and you can contact me directly anytime, and you'll also help support make these videos. So thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.